If I had known that my brother's wedding that day would flip our entire family dynamic, I might have chosen a flashier dress, or at least prepared a smirk. But I didn't. I walked into the reception hall in a simple navy nude dress, entirely unremarkable, and with no intention of standing out. My family still thought I was just a mid-level employee at some third-rate consulting firm. They were wrong, and today they would find that out, one by one. Ethan's wedding, my brother, was held at the Bradford Estate, a luxury resort in the suburbs of Denver, with a ballroom decked out in polished white marble and crystal chandeliers hanging like crowns. Ethan had always loved extravagance. Even back in high school, he said that one day he'd marry a CEO's daughter and throw a wedding that the whole town would remember. He kept his word. Today, he was marrying Lillian Carter, daughter of the founder of Carter Tech Group, and had invited nearly 300 guests, at least a third of whom were, in my opinion, just there for the free buffet. I picked a seat near the window, where the late afternoon sun streamed through the large glass panes, making my champagne glass sparkle like liquid gold. I wasn't trying to get attention. I had spent the last decade hidden behind the image of Sophia, the financial advisor at some mid-tier consulting firm. No one asked further, and I never explained. They were content thinking I was still struggling with some obscure job, and I was even more content that they knew nothing. My mother, Susan, walked over with a strained smile. Finally found you. Thought you'd gone off somewhere again taking work notes like always. She glanced at my dress. Not rude, but she didn't bother hiding her disappointment. It is your brother's wedding after all. I thought you'd dress up a little more. I took a sip of my drink and smiled. I think this dress is just fine. I didn't want to outshine the bride. She raised an eyebrow but said nothing. That's how she always was. Polite on the surface, every word intentional. To her, Ethan was the pride of the family. I was the one, with personality, who refused to live realistically. Back when I was getting my MBA, she once asked, "Don't you think you should try something less risky?" I just laughed then. Risk to her meant leaving her comfort zone. But to me, the real risk was living a whole life, trying to please people who never truly saw me. The wedding continued with lively jazz and cheerful chatter. Ethan entered the room in an expensive tuxedo, his smile stretched so wide it seemed to pull at the sides of his face. When his eyes swept past me, he gave a nod, as if I were an old coworker he happened to run into. Not surprising. The last time we had a real conversation was 3 years ago, when he asked to borrow $30,000, 0 cents, for a startup that turned out to be a 6-week trip across Europe. I never brought it up again, but I never forgot. Lillian, the new bride, emerged from backstage in a glittering mermaid gown. She looked stunning. Cold, proper, and exactly the kind of ideal daughter-in-law my mom had always dreamed of. No one noticed me sitting in the corner of the room. No one needed to. To them, I was just the ordinary little sister, still buried in financial reports no one cared to understand. What would they think if they knew I just signed a $480 million 0 cents merger deal yesterday? I smiled, set my drink down, and looked up at the chandelier, glittering, as if reflecting something very interesting about to unfold. "Oh, Sophia, didn't expect to see you here." Ethan's voice rang out behind me, tinged with obvious amusement. I turned around to see him walking over with Lillian on his arm, the crystal lighting glinting off his perfectly tailored suit, like he'd stepped out of a magazine cover. His face was beaming. Not with marital joy, but from the way the crowd orbited around him like he was the center of the universe. I stood and offered a polite nod. "Congratulations, Ethan, you look dazzling today." He smirked, not even trying to hide the condescension. "Yeah, we think so too." Lillian picked everything, from the flower colors to the chocolate favors. "Perfect, right?" Lillian raised an eyebrow, her gaze drifting over me like she was sizing up a cheap piece of furniture in a luxury showroom. "What are you doing these days, Sophia? Ethan said you're still working at, what was it, Spark Point or something?" Ethan pretended to think, then snorted. "No, it's Brightstone, some tiny consulting firm. You know, those places that help small businesses survive tax season." I pressed my lips together, keeping calm. Ethan knew full well I had never once mentioned my company's name, because I deliberately avoided it. But he made one up anyway, just to downplay me in front of all the watching eyes. "Oh right," Lillian chimed in. "That sounds cute, like one of those basement startups. But hey, at least you're independent." I was about to respond, but didn't get the chance. My mother, Susan, stepped in, tugging my arm away from Ethan's little crowd. "She's not really settled yet, but at least she's not leeching off anyone." She turned to a nearby woman and lowered her voice, just enough that I could still hear. "Sophia's always been different. Not like Ethan. She never cared about family, always wants to work, somewhere, quietly, like she's avoiding real life or something." My chest burned. Not from the alcohol, but from something far more familiar. The silence of years spent being overlooked. I could have stayed quiet one more time, but something inside me cracked, like thin ice under pressure. "Mom," I said calmly, my voice as sharp as a blade. "I'm not avoiding anything. I just don't share because no one ever listens." She turned, eyes wide in surprise. "What are you talking about? We always check in on you." "How exactly?" I didn't wait for an answer. "Every time I call, you're too busy planning Ethan's parties. Every holiday, I get automated emails while Ethan gets a Rolex. You call that care?" Lillian stepped in, holding a wine glass. "Come on, it's a happy day. What's with all the tension?" "It's nothing," Ethan cut in. "Sophia's just sensitive. She always thinks people don't respect her work." I looked him in the eye. He knew I wouldn't expose him, not now, but I saw it clearly, the smugness in his eyes, waiting to stomp me down like always. "Yeah," I nodded. "I am sensitive. I can feel the contempt in the eyes of my own family." The air froze. A guest behind us cleared their throat. Someone else swirled their wineglass to avoid eye contact. "Sophia," my mother interjected, trying to diffuse the moment. "We just want the best for you. You should look at Ethan. Clear path, stable career, not vague little projects." "I'm not vague," I cut in, lifting my chin in the middle of them. "I just don't live according to someone else's blueprint." I saw Ethan's hand tighten around his wineglass, his jaw clenched. Lillian smiled, but the kind of smile you give when you just stepped in mud and don't want to stain your shoes. I turned away. I didn't need to hear more. They could carry on with their grand wedding, continue performing as the model family. But they didn't know. Today would be the last time they ever got to look at me as the disappointment. A soft chime rang out from the main entrance. The wedding manager hurried out to greet a new guest. Murmurs rippled through the room. Someone whispered, "I think that's Mr. James Wilson, CEO of Winfield Holdings." I took a sip of wine, lips curling slightly. Now the party was really about to begin. A wave of whispers swept through the ballroom like an electric current as the man stepped inside. James Wilson, the CEO of Winfield Holdings, had just arrived, and every pair of eyes instantly turned to him. Tall, silver hair combed neatly, as if every strand had purpose. He carried the presence of someone who never entered a room without silencing it. Ethan straightened up, quickly pulling Lillian to her feet. I saw him glance at our father, Richard, who was seated near the reception table. The whole family seemed to sense that James's arrival wasn't just unexpected, it was a turning point. Just not in the way they thought. Ethan adjusted his tie, rubbed his hands together excitedly, then walked toward James like he was about to be knighted at a coronation banquet. But James didn't look at him. His gaze swept the room and stopped. On me. A slow smile spread across his face as he strode toward the table where I sat. Ethan halted mid-step, glancing around as if he couldn't believe what was happening. "Ms. Monroe," James said, his voice deep and clear. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I should have known, shouldn't I?" The room froze. I calmly placed my champagne glass on the table, stood up, and shook his hand with steady poise. "Hello, James. This is a surprise. I thought you had a meeting in Seattle this morning." I canceled it when my assistant mentioned you might be in Colorado this week. Meeting with you is always a top priority. I saw Lillian clutch Ethan's hand tighter, like she needed to confirm she was still conscious. As for Ethan, he looked like he was about to pass out. My mother, still standing nearby, was stunned, her eyes locked on the scene. She once told me I should learn to speak modestly, like a small-time consultant. I imagine now she was starting to question whether she'd misjudged who was who. She's... Miss Monroe, someone behind me whispered. James nodded at me again, then turned to Ethan, who was frozen stiff. Oh, this is your brother? He once told me his sister worked at a local consulting firm. Didn't realize she was... I smiled, eyes fixed on Ethan. Winfield Holdings is in merger talks with my company, James. He didn't know that. No one in my family does. Lillian blurted out. You run what company? Aurora Consulting Group. James answered for me, his voice like summer thunder. One of the leading strategic consulting firms in the United States. Ms. Monroe is the founder, CEO, and the person we're hoping to get final approval from on a deal worth nearly $500 million. The sound of a glass shattering rang out from a nearby table. The guests seemed to collectively hold their breath. All the noise in the room suddenly felt distant in the face of one overwhelming truth, that the woman once dismissed as the forgettable little sister was, in fact, the centerpiece everyone was chasing. Ethan stammered. Sophia. Why didn't you ever say anything? I looked at him and replied slowly. Because you never asked, and if you did, you never listened. His eyes wavered, his fingers turning white around his glass. I could see pieces of his pride cracking, bit by bit. James Wilson turned back to me. Do you have a few minutes, Sophia? I think we should go over a few of the revised terms. I've got the latest draft from legal. I nodded, then looked at my family. My mother, father, brother, and sister-in-law, standing frozen. My mother's face was pale, my father's mouth agape, as if words had abandoned him. Ethan simply stared at the floor, unable to form a single excuse. I said quietly, Excuse me, we have business to discuss. Something about the future of a company I believe you're very proud to be working for. Then I turned, walking beside James, striding confidently through a ballroom drowned in stunned silence and disbelief. And in that moment, beneath the glittering chandelier, beneath the countless eyes now watching my every step, I understood one thing. The simple navy dress I wore today was the only armor I ever needed. I had just left the meeting table with James Wilson for less than 10 minutes when I received a message from Emma, my assistant. A simple text. Ethan's losing it. Your mom just started crying in front of guests. Do you want me to step in? I typed back one line, no, let them face it themselves. When I returned to the ballroom, the atmosphere had shifted completely. The laughter was gone, the clinking of celebratory glasses silenced. Everyone had dispersed, leaving a gap in the center of the room as if afraid to get too close to the emotional ground zero. Ethan stood in the middle, his face flushed with rage and humiliation. Lillian clung to his arm in confusion, unable to speak. My parents stood nearby. My mother stammering through tears, my father uncharacteristically silent, which was rare for someone who liked to call himself the family's strategic brain. I stepped forward, keeping my tone calm. It seems everyone's waiting for an explanation. My mother looked up, eyes red and swollen. Sophia, why didn't you say anything? All these years, we had no idea. No idea? I raised an eyebrow, cutting her off. Or, didn't want to know. My father clasped his hands behind his back, still trying to maintain his air of authority. We only wanted you to choose the safe path. Business is a ruthless field, especially for women, you should understand. Understand? I laughed, the sound slicing through the thick silence. Should I understand why you refused to help me secure a loan when I presented a startup plan down to the last digit? Understand why you wouldn't co-sign a loan but had no problem withdrawing $40,000 from my savings to fund Ethan's creative coffee shop, which shut down 3 months later? Ethan cut in, his voice hoarse. You agreed to lend me that. I didn't agree, I looked him dead in the eye. I was forced to. Because at the time, I was struggling to pay rent in Chicago, and Mom was crying over the phone saying your brother will lose his chance if he doesn't get that money. And you promised to pay it back within 6 months. It's been 8 years, Ethan. Lillian stared at him, stunned. Ethan, you never told me that. He fumbled. It was just a family advance. Sophia, you can't put all this on me. You turned out fine. I scoffed. Yes, I turned out fine. Because I learned how to survive without support from my own blood. I turned toward my mother. You once told me, don't be too ambitious, find a job that suits a woman. But when Ethan said he wanted to study business management, a field he was never good at, you sold Grandma's wedding necklace to pay his tuition. She froze. You eavesdropped? No, Grandma told me herself. She said you didn't want to sell it. But for Ethan, you did. I paused, feeling the air around us grow colder and tighter. Mom, I never asked for anything. When I got accepted into a market research program in San Francisco, you said it was an unnecessary luxury. When I started my company, you called it a silly dream. But when your son failed 3 times in a row, you always had excuses, forgave him, and blamed the circumstances. My father finally spoke, his voice heavy. You have the right to be upset with us, but Sophia, this isn't the way. Not the way? I turned to him, eyes burning. What about your way? The way you belittled me for a decade. The way you told every relative, Sophia just does little odds and ends. Don't expect much. The way you once banned me from talking about finance at a family dinner because it ruined the appetite. No one responded. I looked at each of them in turn. Ethan lowered his head. Lillian couldn't meet my eyes. My mother stood motionless. My father, the usual proud confidence in his eyes was gone. They looked like they were seeing a ghost they thought they'd buried long ago. Only now it had returned, more alive and powerful than ever. I didn't come here for revenge, I said, my voice dropping low. I came because I thought I could keep my promise to Grandpa, to make sure Winfield wouldn't fall into the hands of vulture funds. But after today, I'm not so sure this deal is worth it anymore. I turned and walked toward the balcony doors, but before I stepped out, I stopped and said one last thing. Family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by who stands by you when you have nothing. Unfortunately, you never have. The next morning, I sat in my office on the 37th floor of Aurora Consulting's headquarters in Denver, gazing out the glass toward the snow-covered Rocky Mountains. The silence felt different, like the air itself was waiting for me to re-establish order, in a world they once thought I had no place running. The final draft of the merger agreement between Aurora and Winfield had just landed in my inbox. James Wilson had staked his entire reputation on me. I knew I held all the power. And today, I intended to use it to say what should have been said years ago. Emma walked in. Miss Monroe, Ethan's waiting in the lounge, 2nd time this week. I glanced at the clock. 9:47 a.m. Let him in, but only 15 minutes. The door opened. Ethan walked in. Not the same brother from yesterday's wedding. His suit was rumpled, tie loose, eyes shadowed. A rare image of collapse. And honestly, I didn't feel even a twinge of pity. He sat down across from me, avoiding my eyes at first. Sophia, can you stop this? I know I was wrong. I crossed my arms, leaning back slightly. Wrong about what? He looked up, weary. Wrong about underestimating you. Wrong for letting everyone think you were just the background sibling. I know you don't need my forgiveness, but I really regret it. I stayed silent for a few seconds, then said, the merger is still moving forward. The executive board approved it this morning. Ethan swallowed hard. And me. I looked him straight in the eyes. You can still stay at Winfield, but not in your current position. He froze. You mean? You'll have to start over. From an entry-level sales position, no privileges, no private office, no assistant. You'll need to actually work and prove yourself. I didn't wait for his reaction and continued. If you do well, you can move up, but there's no room left for anyone who survives solely on name and connections. Ethan exhaled, almost like he was coming to terms with it. Maybe for the first time, he understood what it meant to be forced to prove your worth. You can really do that? You had every privilege I never did. You were handed chances, praised, forgiven, again and again. I had to create opportunity from nothing. So yes, I absolutely can. I stood up, signaling the end of the conversation. Emma will send the official offer for the new position. You have 3 days to respond. Ethan got up, shoulders slumped like someone who had just heard a final verdict. But before leaving, he stopped at the door. I'm still your family, no matter what. I looked at him, my voice low. Family isn't who remembers you when you succeed. Family is who stood by you when you had nothing. After he left, I turned back to my desk, where a small photo frame sat in the corner. Me and Grandma on the opening day of Aurora's first office, in a tiny retail plaza in Boulder. She was the only one who ever believed I could do it. She was family. That afternoon I received 2 uninvited guests, my parents. Emma informed me through the intercom, but I had already expected it. They walked in trying to look composed. My mother wore the silk blouse she used to save for holidays, and my father had on his usual gray suit from his days as a bank vice president. But their eyes no longer held the pride they once did. Sophia, my mother spoke first. Can we sit and talk as a family? I shook my head and pointed to the chair across from me. We can talk, but not as family. My mother frowned. My father stifled a sigh. You're making this difficult over emotions. Not emotions, I replied. Principles. You don't get to stand next to my success when you abandoned me every step of the way. My father's tone grew stern. But we are family, Sophia. That has to mean something. I nodded. Yes, family means something, but not just a title to cling to. True family listens, supports, and takes responsibility when they're wrong. If not, they're just strangers who share your blood. The room fell silent. I pulled a file from my drawer and set it on the table. The company will send a restructuring contract to your house. If you want to collaborate in the future, as shareholders, read it carefully. If not, I suggest stepping away quietly. My mother began to cry. My father said nothing. I needed nothing else from them. Not a late apology, not a hug, and certainly not validation from people who never truly saw me. I walked them out of the office, closed the door, then sat back down, and took a deep breath. I wasn't seeking revenge, I was just restoring order to the world. The board meeting of Winfield Holdings took place at 10 o'clock in the morning on the 46th floor of the Legacy Tower headquarters, where every critical decision was made in leather-wrapped glass rooms under the cold glow of ceiling lights. I walked in wearing a perfectly tailored black Armani suit, not to impress but to declare. The game had changed. James Wilson stood as soon as he saw me, a respectful nod, a firm handshake. The 14 other directors representing investment funds, major shareholders, and former executives turned in unison as I approached the center seat at the table. Thank you all for being on time, I began, my voice steady and clear in a room where power had long been dictated by names, not merit. I'm Sophia Monroe, CEO of Aurora Consulting Group, and as of today, I will be leading the full operational restructuring of Winfield Holdings. A gray-haired director seated to James's left raised an eyebrow. Full restructuring? What exactly do you mean, Miss Monroe? I placed the binder on the table. I mean, positions filled through relationships will be eliminated. Departments underperforming for the past 2 years will be dissolved or merged. And all senior leaders will be re-evaluated based on actual performance, not title or tenure. A hush swept across the room for several seconds. Then came the sound of papers flipping, throats clearing, whispered remarks. I didn't wait for approval. I launched the presentation screen. This is the 5-year financial report for Winfield. While revenue increased by an average of 4% annually, operating costs rose by 18%. The market research, internal communications, and logistics departments have each been consuming over $4 million per quarter, with no clear contribution to growth. I moved to the next chart. Meanwhile, Aurora, using a lean management structure, cut internal costs by 35% in the same period, while doubling our growth. Another director flipped open a file, unable to hide his curiosity. Are you planning to replace the entire middle management team? Not planning, I replied plainly. Doing. All department heads are required to submit a 90-day action plan within 1 week. Anyone who doesn't meet expectations will be removed. No exceptions. I scanned the room, then paused at the exact spot where I knew my parents stood behind a one-way mirror, watching. I didn't need to see them to know their minds were reeling. Because the daughter they once called forgettable was now redrawing the power map of an entire corporation. James Wilson adjusted his glasses and leaned back. I've worked with many leaders, he said slowly. But today I see clearly why. Aurora has come this far. I nodded in place of a thank you and ended with the final slide. And finally, starting next quarter, the Human Resources Department will operate based on actual performance metrics, not family legacy. We will evaluate all employees by productivity, including Deputy Executive Director Ethan Monroe. A soft wave of murmurs rose, then quickly died down, as if no one wanted to be the first to break the silence. I knew Ethan was watching from outside. And I knew that would shatter his last illusion. I closed with a sentence that needed no embellishment. No one keeps their seat just because they were once called the successor. When the meeting ended, a few board members approached to shake my hand. No longer with the caution from earlier. Only recognition remained. James came closer, admiration in his eyes. You know, Sophia, a lot of people are talented, but not everyone has the guts to change an entire system from the ground up. You just did that. I smiled, softly but firmly. I didn't come to tweak numbers, I came to rewrite the rules. As I walked out of the boardroom, passing through the glass hallway, I saw the silhouettes of my parents and Ethan standing outside. My mother wiped away tears. My father gripped the armrest of his chair. And Ethan. He lowered his head, no longer able to look me in the eye. I didn't stop, there was nothing left to say. Because in my life they no longer held the power. And I didn't need their belief, because the entire board believed in me now. 3 days after the board meeting, I received a notification from Emma. Your family's here again. All of them. I rose from my desk and walked slowly to the VIP lounge on the 37th floor, where they were waiting. No coffee service. No fresh flowers like I offered important guests. Just cold white lighting and straight-backed leather chairs that made sitting feel like a test of endurance. Ethan stood first when he saw me. He wore a wrinkled white shirt at the cuffs, no longer the man who walked into the wedding hall with his billionaire bride. My father, Mr. Richard, sat upright, hands clasped, trying to stay composed. My mother looked directly at me, eyes red and puffy as if she had cried all night. Sophia, Ethan spoke first, voice choked. I don't want to lose this position. I'll start over, I swear. I'm just asking, please. Don't remove me from the system. Give me a chance. I didn't answer immediately. I looked at him for a long moment before asking, why? Because you've changed? Or because you have nowhere else to turn now? He lowered his head and stayed silent. My father spoke next. Sophia, what happened at the wedding? I've never felt so ashamed in my life, but I've thought it over. If you're willing, let's start over. I sat across from them, arms folded. At that moment, I wasn't a CEO. I wasn't a founder. I was just a daughter who had never been acknowledged, until she no longer needed acknowledgement. Start over? I repeated. Unfortunately, life doesn't come with a reset button, Father. My mother sobbed. I was wrong, Sophia. I let my expectations blind me to the truth. You worked hard, and I never saw it. I didn't smile. I didn't soften. Instead, I opened the drawer and took out an old photograph, the only family photo I ever kept. In it, Ethan stood in the center, arms around our parents. I stood off to the side, a stiff smile on my face, wearing a dress I had sewn myself because Mom said, "It's a waste of money for something small like a graduation party." I placed the photo on the table, voice steady. For 10 years I waited for this. One acknowledgement. One apology. One genuine hug. But all I ever got were sarcasm, silence, and distant looks. Ethan looked up. "I didn't know you were in that much pain. If I had known..." I cut him off, voice still even. "If you had known, what then, Ethan? You'd give back the money you blew on that European vacation? You'd defend me when our parents belittled me? Or you'd just smile less?" The room fell silent. I didn't come here to tear this family apart, but I have no obligation to mend it either. My father's voice tightened. "You're just walking away, Sophia? After all this?" "No, Father," I replied. "I'm choosing to live. Truly live. As someone who once fell apart from being dismissed by her own family, but still stood up again, without anyone's help." My mother reached across the table, voice trembling. "You are our flesh and blood, Sophia. Blood ties can't be broken." I gently pushed my chair back, avoiding her touch. "I'm not breaking ties. I'm just done pretending everything was ever okay. Because all this time, I've lived in a family that existed only in pictures and polished words, when the reality was full of favoritism, toxic expectations, and empty lectures." I stood. "Ethan will have a chance, a real chance to prove himself. No privileges, no shortcuts." I looked my parents in the eye. "And the two of you? If you truly want to start over, then begin by facing what you've chosen to forget. And if someday I believe that's sincere, maybe I'll open my heart." I bent down, picked up the photo, placed it back into the drawer, and ended the meeting with one final statement. I no longer live to be accepted. I live to be free. When I stepped out of the room, Emma was already waiting. She looked at me with admiration. Not for the power I held, but for the strength I had forged through years of loneliness and quiet battles. I didn't look back at them. I didn't need to, because the moment they lost me was also the moment I finally found myself. That night, I returned to my penthouse on the 42nd floor just before midnight. The city of Denver glowed beneath me like a galaxy with every light bulb anchored to the earth. But tonight, those lights didn't make me feel small anymore. Not because I'd sat at the head of the boardroom, not because I'd forced my family to face the truth, but because I felt utterly free from my past. I took off my shoes and walked barefoot across the cold wooden floor. In the quiet space, only the soft hum of the air conditioner could be heard. I sat down by the window, the spot I always chose when I needed silence to think. On the table was a small wooden box, old but carefully preserved over the years. I opened the lid. Inside was a heart-shaped locket, the last gift from my grandmother Helen. She passed away the year I started my business, but she left me something far more valuable than money. A handwritten note, carefully folded and placed inside the locket. I unfolded the paper, reading each line, even though I had long since memorized every word. Success doesn't come from who believes in you at the end, but from whether you believed in yourself from the beginning. A single tear ran down my cheek. Not from sadness, but because I knew that if she were still alive, she wouldn't just be proud. She would say, "At last, my dear. You've walked forward without bowing your head." I didn't build Aurora to prove anything to anyone. I founded it because I knew that if I didn't believe in myself, no one else would. My whole life had been lived inside frameworks imposed by others, of being a good daughter, a supportive little sister, or a child who should know her place. But not anymore. My phone buzzed, a message from James Wilson. "Tomorrow's meeting is scheduled. But if you need more time, I can push it back. You've done a lot this week." I replied, "No need. I'm ready." There's no vacation after a victory. But I didn't need one, because I wasn't winning against anyone else. I had only won against myself. I stood and walked through the living room where a large frame hung on the wall. My first business plan, printed from an old printer in a one-bedroom apartment in Boulder. I had slept on the floor for 3 months to save on rent, ate instant noodles instead of ordering takeout, and cried in the dark on many nights after being rejected by 12 investors in a row. But I didn't stop. And that is what defined me. Not the praise from the board, not Ethan's stunned silence, and certainly not my parents' belated remorse. I looked at my reflection in the large glass pane. The woman in the mirror was no longer Sophia, the little sister of Deputy Director Ethan Monroe. She was Sophia Monroe, the woman who built an empire from the bricks others had discarded. Tomorrow, Sterling would officially become a subsidiary of Aurora. The same faces that once dismissed me would now have to sit under my authority. The whispers from the wedding would fall silent. And, of course, those who once tried to cut me out of the game would have to learn to live by my rules. But even then, I wouldn't make that my purpose. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need them to regret me forever. I just needed to keep going, on the path I chose, without asking for permission, without bowing my head, and without waiting for approval. I placed the locket back into the box and closed the lid, then looked out at the city once more. I no longer lived for someone to believe in me. I lived because I had chosen to believe in myself from day one. And in that, everything had finally begun. Sophia's story is a powerful reminder that recognition doesn't always come from family or society. It begins with believing in yourself. Despite being underestimated, used, and abandoned by those closest to her, she built her career with her own hands. Her success wasn't about revenge, but a declaration that true value never needs anyone's permission. In a world often loud with judgment, sometimes quiet resilience is the loudest voice of all. What do you think about Sophia's journey? Should she forgive her family? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to follow the channel for more heartfelt stories about family, dignity, and life's defining choices.